The Slow Destruction of Henry VIII, extended version, 1 to 2 hours. We know almost exactly what Henry VIII looked like at the age of 22, because the Venetian ambassador Pasqualigo described him in 1515 with the kind of detail that diplomats reserved for rulers worth impressing. He was, Pasqualigo wrote, extremely handsome. His face was angelic rather than merely handsome. He spoke French, Latin, and some Italian. He played the lute and harpsichord. He composed music. He danced with extraordinary skill. He jousted, hunted, and debated theology. And he did all of these things with a conspicuous ease that courtiers across Europe found simultaneously admirable and unsettling, because he was already the most powerful man in England, and he moved as though he knew it in his bones. By 1546, 31 years later, this same man could not walk unaided. He could not climb stairs. He could not bear the touch of fabric against his legs without pain. The surviving armor he wore in his final years has a waist measurement of approximately 52 inches. The smell from his person had become, according to multiple contemporary accounts, impossible to disguise with any quantity of perfume or incense. The trajectory from one to the other is not a mystery, not a conspiracy, and not a covered-up secret. It is documented in extensive detail by people who were in the room, and it is one of the most medically and psychologically interesting cases in the history of European monarchy. But to understand what destroyed Henry VIII, you need to understand what Henry VIII actually was before the destruction began. Not the tabloid version that starts with wives and ends with obesity. The real version, which begins with a young man so gifted, so powerful, and so certain of his own divine mandate that the specific ways his body and mind failed him over 30 years, become not just medical history, but a story about what happens when a system built entirely around one person's will meets the one force that will eventually defeat every human being regardless of rank, time, and the damage that accumulates within it. This is that story, told from the verified historical record, all of it. Part 1. The prince who should have been perfect. Henry VIII was not supposed to be king. That fact is essential to understanding almost everything that followed, because it shaped the specific psychological formation of a man who would spend his entire reign simultaneously certain of his absolute right to rule and terrified that it might be taken from him. Henry was born on June 28, 1491, the second son of Henry VII and Elizabeth of York. His older brother Arthur was the heir, the carefully prepared, diplomatically positioned, politically significant heir, named deliberately after the legendary British king to signal a new golden age for the Tudor dynasty that Henry VII had founded by defeating Richard III at Bosworth Field in 1485. Arthur was the investment, Henry was the spare. This distinction shaped their educations fundamentally. Arthur was trained for kingship from infancy, state papers, diplomatic protocol, the machinery of governance, the performance of royal authority. Henry was educated differently, with the freedom of someone who would never bear the full weight of the crown. He was given to humanist scholars, taught languages and music and theology and philosophy, encouraged in physical excellence as a gentleman rather than a future monarch. He became, in the most literal sense, one of the best educated men in England, not because education was his duty, but because it was his pleasure. Then Arthur died. On April 2, 1502, Arthur Tudor died at Ludlow Castle, probably of sweating sickness, 15 years old, and married only 5 months to Catherine of Aragon. The 17-year-old Spanish princess was left widowed in a foreign country, her political value suddenly uncertain, while the Tudor succession shifted entirely to the younger son, who had been reading Erasmus and practicing the lute. Henry was 10 years old when his brother died. He became Prince of Wales. He became, in that moment, the entire future of a dynasty that his father had spent his reign trying to make permanent. Henry VII's response to this development was characteristic of a man whose every instinct was shaped by the precariousness of how he had obtained power. He tightened control. The young Henry spent his adolescence under close supervision, limited in his movements, restricted in his company, kept close to his father's household. Henry VII had come to power through war and survived through political manipulation. He had no intention of allowing his surviving heir to be assassinated, kidnapped, or politically compromised before the succession could be secured. The result was a young man of exceptional intellectual and physical gifts who had spent years being managed, educated, developed, but also constrained. When Henry VII died on April 22, 1509, and the 18-year-old Henry VIII ascended the throne, what the court encountered was not a trained ruler, but a force of nature that had been dammed up for years finally releasing. The celebrations that followed his accession were extraordinary, even by royal standards. He was young, he was beautiful, he was educated, he jousted superbly, he composed songs, he debated theology. He spoke languages, he knew his Erasmus, he had read Thomas More, and he was the King of England, with no significant political rivals and a treasury his father had filled through decades of careful accumulation. The Venetian ambassador Sebastian Giustinian, writing in 1519, described a king who was the handsomest potentate I ever set eyes on. Above the usual height, with an extremely fine calf to his leg, his complexion very fair and bright, with auburn hair combed straight and short in the French fashion, and a round face so very beautiful that it would become a pretty woman. He noted the king's facility at the organ, the lute, and singing. He described a man who seemed to embody everything a Renaissance monarch was supposed to be. This is the starting point. The man who begins the story is not the grotesque figure who ends it. He is something much more interesting, a genuinely exceptional human being whose specific gifts and specific deficits will interact with specific historical circumstances and specific physical damage in ways that produce one of the most dramatic personal deteriorations in the historical record. Part 2. 6 Women, 1 Body, 38 Years. Henry VIII's 6 marriages are the most famous element of his biography, and the element most commonly stripped of the medical and psychological context that makes them comprehensible. They are usually presented as a sequence of appetites. The king wanted a son, the king wanted a different woman, the king executed people who inconvenienced him. The reality is more specific and more disturbing. Each marriage was also a medical event in Henry's life, and reading them in that frame reveals patterns that the tabloid narrative obscures entirely. Catherine of Aragon, 1509 to 1533. Henry married Catherine of Aragon 6 weeks after his father's death, in June 1509. She was 23, he was 17. The marriage had been his father's diplomatic project. Catherine had been Arthur's widow since 1502, held in England in a state of semi-captivity, while the two crowns negotiated her status and her dowry. And the young Henry married her partly from genuine affection, partly from dynastic calculation, and partly as an immediate act of independence from his late father's controlling management. The early years of the marriage were by most accounts genuinely happy. Henry wrote letters to Catherine during military campaigns that contemporaries considered models of affectionate correspondence. He showed her public honor. The problem was children, or more precisely, the absence of surviving male children. Catherine's reproductive history is one of the most medically documented royal pregnancies of the Tudor era, and it is a record of almost unbroken tragedy. She was pregnant at least 6 times between 1510 and 1518. January 1510, a stillborn daughter, or possibly a premature birth that survived only briefly. January 1511, a son, Henry, Duke of Cornwall, who lived 52 days and died. Henry VIII's grief at this loss was described by contemporaries as intense and genuine. 1513, a stillborn son. 1514, a son who died shortly after birth. 1515, a daughter, Mary, who survived and would eventually reign as Mary I. The pattern of Catherine's reproductive failures has been analyzed by modern medicine with various proposed explanations. Rh incompatibility between Catherine and Henry has been proposed, and debated. Some researchers have examined the possibility of genetic factors contributed by Henry specifically. What is clear is that by the early 1520s, with Catherine in her late 30s and Mary the only surviving child, the prospect of a male heir from this marriage was diminishing with every passing year. Henry's response to this pattern is documented through the 1520s as one of increasing anxiety, religious obsession, and eventually a conviction, one that he arrived at gradually and then held with the tenacity characteristic of a man who was brilliant at constructing arguments for what he already wanted to believe, that his marriage to his brother's widow was theologically invalid. Whether he believed this argument entirely or used it as a theologically respectable framework for what was essentially a political and personal decision to end the marriage is a question historians have debated for centuries without resolution. Anne Boleyn entered this picture not, as popular history sometimes suggests, as a simple object of lust, but as a specific political and personal proposition. She was educated, sharp, politically sophisticated, and from a family with court ambitions. She was also, crucially, younger than Catherine, which meant the possibility of male heirs remained open. And she was determined not to become a royal mistress, a category she had observed produce no lasting security, but a queen. Anne Boleyn, 1533 to 1536. The years of Henry's pursuit of Anne Boleyn, roughly 1526 to 1533, were also the years that transformed the English Church and the English state in ways whose consequences are still visible in British institutions today. Henry's desire for an annulment required papal cooperation. Pope Clement VII, however, was in no position to provide it. Catherine's nephew was Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, whose troops had sacked Rome in 1527 and effectively held the Pope as a political prisoner. Clement could not grant Henry's annulment without provoking the most powerful ruler in Europe. He therefore stalled for years. Henry's eventual solution, and this is where his genuine intellectual engagement with theology becomes inseparable from his personal ambitions, was to reframe the question entirely. If the Pope would not grant the annulment, then perhaps the Pope did not have legitimate authority over English church matters. Between 1532 and 1534, a series of parliamentary acts systematically severed the English Church from Rome's authority. The Act in Restraint of Appeals, 1533, declared England an empire, meaning its courts had final jurisdiction over all English legal matters, including the marriage case. The Act of Supremacy, 1534, made Henry the supreme head of the Church of England. Henry married Anne Boleyn in January 1533. She was already pregnant. The child born on September 7, 1533, was a girl, Elizabeth, the future Queen Elizabeth I of England. Henry's documented reaction to the birth of a daughter, rather than the son that had been publicly anticipated, was of profound disappointment. The celebrations that had been planned were scaled back. Henry had disrupted his entire kingdom, broken with the international church, executed prominent men who refused to accept the new ecclesiastical settlement, and what he had to show for it was another daughter. Anne's subsequent pregnancies were no more successful than Catherine's had been. She miscarried in 1534, possibly a boy. In January 1536, she miscarried again, a pregnancy that would have been approximately 4 months advanced at the time of Henry's jousting accident on January 24. What is documented is that by early 1536, Henry's marriage to Anne Boleyn was in serious trouble, and the jousting accident occurred at precisely the moment when the marriage's future was most uncertain. Anne Boleyn was arrested on May 2, 1536. She was charged with adultery with 5 men, including her own brother, charges that the overwhelming majority of modern historians consider fabricated, constructed to provide a legal basis for removing a queen who had become politically inconvenient. She was tried, convicted on evidence that would not pass basic scrutiny in any legal system, and executed on May 19, 1536. Jane Seymour, 1536 to 1537. Henry married Jane Seymour 11 days after Anne Boleyn's execution. She was a lady-in-waiting who had attracted his attention during the final period of his second marriage. Quiet, compliant, traditional in manner. Jane Seymour became Queen of England in May 1536. On October 12, 1537, she gave birth to a son, Edward, the future Edward VI. 12 days later, Jane Seymour died of what contemporaries described as childbed fever, almost certainly puerperal infection, which in the pre-antibiotic era was a death sentence once it took hold. She was approximately 29 years old. Henry's grief at Jane's death was, by contemporary accounts, genuine and prolonged. He wore black for 3 months, an unusually extended period of formal mourning. Jane Seymour is significant in the medical history of Henry's decline for 2 reasons. First, her death in 1537, a year after the jousting accident, meant that Henry was left without the stabilizing domestic presence, at precisely the moment when the physical and possibly neurological consequences of the accident were beginning to manifest. Second, the son she produced, Edward, was the male heir Henry had spent 28 years and 2 marriages trying to obtain. The achievement of this goal did not, as might have been expected, produce psychological resolution. It produced instead a period of frenetic political maneuvering, as Henry and his council managed the implications of an heir who was, in 1537, a newborn. Anne of Cleves, January-July 1540. The marriage to Anne of Cleves is the most revealing of Henry's 6 marriages from a medical and psychological standpoint, because it is the one that most clearly shows the collision between Henry's self-image and his physical reality. The marriage was Thomas Cromwell's project. Henry needed a new wife. Cromwell needed a Protestant alliance in Europe. The Duke of Cleves had a daughter of appropriate age and Protestant credentials. Hans Holbein was sent to paint Anne's portrait. The portrait showed an attractive woman in formal dress. Henry agreed to the match. When Anne of Cleves arrived in England in December 1539 and Henry met her at Rochester, he was, according to multiple contemporary accounts, shocked. The woman he met did not correspond to his expectations. He described her to Cromwell as a Flanders mare horse, not what had been represented, not what he had anticipated. He was deeply reluctant to go through with the marriage. The medical dimension here is significant. Henry was 48 years old. His leg condition had been chronic for 3 years. His weight had increased substantially. He was experiencing what was almost certainly significant pain on a daily basis. And he was being asked to perform as a husband with a woman he found unattractive and had not chosen. The marriage was consummated, or was it? Henry's own statements about the marriage are contradictory and clearly motivated by the need to establish legal grounds for annulment. He told his physicians that he had been unable to consummate the marriage because he found Anne physically repulsive, and that he had experienced problems with potency when he attempted to do so. His physicians recorded these statements. This is one of the earliest documented suggestions in the historical record that Henry was experiencing sexual dysfunction, though the circumstances make it impossible to determine how much was physical, how much psychological, and how much strategic framing for the annulment case. The marriage was annulled in July 1540, after approximately 6 months. Anne of Cleves, who was intelligent enough to understand her situation clearly, agreed to the annulment gracefully, accepted a substantial financial settlement, and lived quietly in England until 1557, outlasting all of Henry's other wives. She has the distinction of being the only one of Henry's 6 wives who died of natural causes in England. Thomas Cromwell, who had arranged the match, was executed for treason 2 weeks after the annulment. The connection between the 2 events is direct. Henry needed someone to blame for the marriage he wished had never happened, and Cromwell was the man who had arranged it. Catherine Howard, 1540 to 1542. Catherine Howard was approximately 17 or 18 years old when she married the 49-year-old Henry in July 1540, 2 weeks after the Anne of Cleves annulment. She was Anne Boleyn's first cousin. She was also, in every available contemporary description, strikingly young in manner as well as in years, someone who had grown up in the chaotic household of the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk, with insufficient supervision and a personal history that included what appears to have been sexual exploitation by men in positions of authority over her before she ever came to court. Henry's attachment to Catherine Howard is documented as intense and, from his perspective, genuinely emotional. He called her his rose without a thorn. He showered her with jewels and property, and the kind of public attention that was itself a political statement. He was, in the most clinical sense, infatuated. The marriage lasted approximately 18 months. In November 1541, Archbishop Cranmer presented Henry with evidence that Catherine Howard had, before her marriage to Henry, been in a sexual relationship with a young man named Francis Dereham, who had subsequently been given a position in her household as queen, and that she was, during the marriage itself, engaged in an affair with a courtier named Thomas Culpeper. Whether the affair with Culpeper was an actual sexual relationship or an emotionally intense but unconsummated connection that was criminalized retrospectively is genuinely debated among historians. The evidence is ambiguous. What is not ambiguous is that Catherine Howard had concealed her premarital sexual history from Henry, which under legislation Henry himself had passed specifically constituted treason. Henry's reaction to the revelation is documented in a specific and medically interesting way. He initially refused to believe it. Then, when evidence became impossible to deny, he is recorded as weeping in front of his council, an unusual public display that contemporaries found both moving and alarming. He complained that he had been so ill-served by wives. He blamed his council for choosing poorly. Catherine Howard was executed on February 13, 1542. She was approximately 19 or 20 years old. The significance of Catherine Howard in the medical history is specific. Her execution in 1542 is the last major act of judicial violence in Henry's reign. After 1542, Henry was increasingly physically unable to conduct the business of government with the energy and directness that had characterized the earlier reign. The executions continued, but the personal engagement diminished. The king, who had watched the destruction of people around him with something close to personal satisfaction, was giving way to a king who watched from a distance, increasingly isolated by his own physical incapacity. Catherine Parr, 1543 to 1547. Catherine Parr was 31 years old and twice widowed when Henry married her in July 1543. She was the last of his 6 wives, and she outlived him, dying in September 1548, the only wife besides Anne of Cleves to survive Henry himself. Catherine Parr's role in Henry's final 4 years is primarily as a caretaker, though that framing diminishes what she actually accomplished. She was an educated woman with strong Protestant convictions who engaged Henry in genuine intellectual and theological discussion, wrote and published religious works of her own, and managed the daily reality of being married to a man in chronic pain, who was increasingly paranoid, volatile, and physically dependent. She also, in 1543, came within a remarkably narrow margin of being arrested for heresy. A faction at court that opposed her Protestant influence persuaded Henry to authorize her arrest. According to the account preserved by John Fox, Catherine learned of the warrant and went immediately to Henry, presenting herself as entirely subordinate to his theological judgment, willing to learn from him in all matters of religion. Henry apparently found this sufficiently satisfying and cancelled the arrest. The warrant that had already been drawn up was presented to Henry later by the Lord Chancellor. Henry reportedly berated the man for a fool and knave. This episode, its details requiring the usual source-critical caution, as Fox was a Protestant polemicist writing with specific rhetorical aims, illustrates the specific danger of Catherine Parr's position. She was managing a man who could, on one afternoon, order her arrest, and on the next, defend her. The unpredictability that characterized the final years of Henry's reign was not merely a political problem. It was a daily existential one for the people closest to him. Catherine Parr is also significant because she reunited Henry's children, Mary, Elizabeth, and Edward, and involved them in a court setting that encouraged their education and their relationship with each other. This is not a trivial contribution. The quality of Edward VI's short reign and Elizabeth I's long one was shaped in part by the educational environment Catherine Parr helped create. Part 3. What the doctors actually did. Tudor medicine operated within a theoretical framework that had been largely unchanged since the ancient Greek physician Galen developed it in the 2nd century CE. The body was understood as governed by 4 humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, whose balance determined health and whose imbalance produced disease. Treatment was accordingly aimed at restoring balance: bleeding to reduce excess blood, purges and enemas to expel harmful humours, dietary modifications to address specific imbalances, and various topical applications of herbs, minerals, and animal-derived substances to address local symptoms. Within this framework, the physicians who attended Henry VIII were doing exactly what their training had prepared them to do. They were not incompetent by the standards of their era. Several of them, particularly Thomas Linacre, who founded the Royal College of Physicians in 1518, and William Butts, who served Henry for over 20 years, were genuine scholars of European medicine, familiar with the best contemporary classical and Arabic medical literature. What they lacked was not intelligence or diligence, but the conceptual tools that would only become available 2 or 3 centuries later. Germ theory, the understanding of infection, effective antibiotics, the ability to distinguish between different types of wound pathology. Henry's leg condition, the fistula that appears repeatedly in the state papers and diplomatic dispatches, was treated by his physicians with the methods available to them. Wound dressings were changed regularly, sometimes twice daily, in periods of acute infection. The specific materials used for these dressings would have included linen cloth soaked in various preparations, wine, which has genuine antiseptic properties, though no one in the Tudor era understood why, egg white, believed to have healing properties, various herbal preparations including comfrey root and calendula, and in some periods, mineral-based compounds, including lead preparations, which we now know would have been actively harmful, introducing heavy metal toxicity into an already compromised wound site. Though Tudor physicians believed these preparations had genuine therapeutic value, the pain management available to Henry was primarily opium-based. Laudanum, a tincture of opium in alcohol, was used in the Tudor period, though its preparation and dosage were inconsistent. Herbal preparations, including valerian and various poppy derivatives, would have been employed. The level of pain control available was nothing approaching what we would consider adequate for someone with chronic bone infection and open leg wounds, which means that Henry VIII spent the last decade of his life in constant, substantial, inadequately managed pain. This is not a minor medical footnote. The neurological effects of chronic pain on mood, on impulse control, on cognitive function, on sleep are well documented in modern medicine. A person living with constant severe pain over years experiences measurable changes in brain function, stress hormone levels, and emotional regulation that can be distinguished from personality in any simple sense. When we read contemporary accounts of Henry's volatility, his rages, his sudden tears, his unpredictability in the final decade of his reign, we are reading descriptions of someone who was, among other things, living with a pain load that current medicine would consider a psychiatric emergency. The physician's daily management of the wound would have required physical access to Henry's legs, which meant that a small group of men, his body physicians and their assistants, were in intimate physical contact with a king in the most humiliating aspects of his physical decline. The wound discharge had to be drained, cleaned, and dressed. The smell, which contemporary dispatches describe as noticeable even at court, would have been present during these procedures at a much more concentrated level. The men who performed these services occupied a peculiar position in Henry's court. Technically servants, practically indispensable, witnesses to the reality of the king's physical condition that his public presentation was constructed to conceal. Thomas Butts appears in Henry's accounts over 20 years as a trusted confidant as well as a physician. He is one of the relatively few people who maintained genuine personal access to Henry throughout the final years. His ability to do this was probably a function of both his medical expertise and his extraordinary diplomatic skill. In managing a patient who was simultaneously in genuine need of medical assistance and deeply reluctant to acknowledge the extent of his deterioration. The physician's inability to cure Henry's condition, despite their genuine best efforts within their theoretical framework, placed them in a politically dangerous position. The king who wanted to be healed, who was in chronic pain, who watched his physical capacity diminish, who desperately needed to believe in his own power and physical vitality, that king was also a man who had previously executed ministers who failed him. The physicians who attended Henry in his final years were navigating a very specific professional and personal risk. They could not cure their patient. They had to tell him things he did not want to hear, and the patient had the power to execute them. So far as the historical record shows, none of Henry's physicians were executed for their medical failures. This says something about their diplomatic skill, and perhaps about Henry's understanding, at some level, of the limits of what medicine could offer. The broader context of Tudor medical practice is worth establishing briefly because it illuminates the specific helplessness Henry faced. The concepts that would eventually produce effective treatment for Henry's probable condition, chronic osteomyelitis or varicose ulceration complicated by obesity and immobility, were centuries away. Louis Pasteur would not establish germ theory until the 1850s. Joseph Lister would not introduce antiseptic surgical technique until 1867. Alexander Fleming would not discover penicillin until 1928. Henry VIII died in 1547. He was waiting for intellectual developments that would arrive 300, 320, and 381 years after his death, respectively. The physicians who attended him were doing everything available to human knowledge at that point. It was not enough. It was never going to be enough. Part 4, The Break with Rome, what it actually was. The English Reformation is often taught as something Henry VIII did, because he wanted to divorce Catherine of Aragon. This is approximately as accurate as saying Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon because he wanted to get to Rome. The event is described, but the description omits everything that makes it interesting. What actually happened between 1529 and 1534 was one of the most consequential restructurings of institutional power in English history, and understanding it requires understanding both Henry's genuine theological beliefs and the specific intersection of personal, political, and financial interests. That made the Reformation possible in England when it had not been possible in France or Spain. Henry VIII was a serious theologian. This is not a polite way of describing a dilettante. In 1521, he wrote and published, with significant assistance from Thomas More, who helped with the Latin, and with papal encouragement, the Assertio Septem Sacramentorum, a defense of the 7 Catholic sacraments against Luther's theological challenges. The work was sophisticated enough that Pope Leo X awarded Henry the title Fidei Defensor, Defender of the Faith, a title that British monarchs still formally hold today, 4 centuries after England broke with the institution that granted it. Henry was not a Protestant. This is a crucial distinction that popular history consistently blurs. He was a Catholic monarch who, for reasons that combined genuine theological conviction with political necessity, concluded that the Pope's authority over the English Church was illegitimate, not because the Pope was theologically wrong in his doctrines, but because the Pope's jurisdictional claims over England had no proper foundation. The English Church, in Henry's framework, was properly under the jurisdiction of the English crown. The doctrines of that church, the Mass, transubstantiation, clerical celibacy, the veneration of saints, remained, in Henry's view, essentially correct. The practical consequence of this distinction was that the English Reformation under Henry was a political and jurisdictional revolution that left much of the theological content of English religious life relatively intact. The monasteries were dissolved, a process that transferred enormous wealth from the church to the crown and then to the aristocracy, but the Mass continued to be celebrated. The clergy continued to wear Catholic vestments. The doctrine of transubstantiation remained legally mandated until well after Henry's death. The people who were executed for heresy under Henry included both Catholics who rejected his supremacy over the Church, Thomas More, John Fisher, and Protestants who went further than Henry wanted in rejecting Catholic doctrine. The famous case of Anne Askew, tortured and burned in 1546 for denying transubstantiation, illustrates the specific theological position Henry maintained to the end. He had broken with Rome, but he had not become a Protestant in any doctrinally meaningful sense. Understanding this matters for the medical and psychological story, because it illuminates the specific character of Henry's certainty. Henry believed with genuine conviction that he had a direct relationship with God that authorized and validated his decisions. The annulment of his marriage to Catherine was not merely politically convenient. It was, in his framework, the correction of a theological error, that God had been punishing him by denying him male heirs. The break with Rome was not apostasy. It was the restoration of proper order, the recovery of the English Church's proper governance from an illegitimate usurpation by a foreign bishop. This theological certainty, the conviction that his will was aligned with divine will, is psychologically significant in a specific way. It meant that opposition to Henry was not merely political resistance, but theological error, and that the people who opposed him were not merely inconvenient, but actively wrong in a cosmic sense. The executions of his reign carried, for Henry, a quality of righteous correction that made them more sustainable psychologically than they would have been for a ruler who acknowledged a purely arbitrary relationship between his power and its exercise. The financial dimension of the dissolution of the monasteries deserves specific attention because it transformed English society in ways that had nothing to do with theology. Between 1536 and 1541, the English crown dissolved approximately 800 monasteries, priories, convents and friaries, and transferred their lands and assets to itself. The total value of this transfer has been estimated at approximately £1.3 million, an enormous sum by 16th century standards, equivalent to perhaps several billion pounds in modern terms. This wealth was not retained by the crown for long. Henry spent it. He spent it on wars, on buildings, on the costs of maintaining a court of his ambitions. Much of it was sold or granted to the nobility and gentry in ways that created a new class of landowners, with a direct financial stake in the Reformation's permanence, because if England ever returned to Rome, the legal status of their newly acquired church lands would be in question. This created a structural anchor for the Protestant Reformation in England that was entirely separate from theology. People who had bought monastery lands didn't need to care about Lutheranism to have strong reasons to prefer that the English Church never return to Rome. Thomas Cromwell administered this process with characteristic efficiency. It is one of the genuine administrative achievements of the Tudor period, the systematic transfer of an enormous amount of institutional wealth with minimal violent resistance. The Pilgrimage of Grace, 1536, was a major northern uprising that specifically targeted the dissolution of the monasteries and the broader direction of the Reformation. And it was large enough, estimates put the number of participants at tens of thousands, to be a genuine threat to Henry's control of the north. Henry's response was to negotiate, grant concessions, and then, when the uprising renewed, execute its leaders, with the specific ruthlessness that characterized his response to challenges he had initially appeared to accommodate. Robert Aske, the principal leader of the Pilgrimage of Grace, was executed in 1537, hung in chains from York Castle until he died, a deliberately prolonged and public death. Henry's mercy had been strategic, not genuine. Part 5. The leg, 11 years of documented deterioration. The leg condition that developed or worsened after the 1536 jousting accident is the central medical fact of Henry's final decade, and it is worth examining in detail that goes beyond the broad outlines. The Spanish ambassador Eustace Chapais is the most valuable contemporary source for Henry's physical condition during this period. Chapais served as imperial ambassador to the English court from 1529 to 1545. which means he was present for the entire arc of Henry's physical decline and had both the opportunity and the motivation to observe and report on it. He was reporting to Charles V, Catherine of Aragon's nephew, who had strong political reasons to understand the health of the English king. Chapuis's dispatches are therefore detailed, relatively dispassionate, and generally regarded by historians as among the most reliable sources for Henry's court. What the Chapuis dispatches show, read chronologically, is a progressive deterioration with specific markers. 1537 to 1538, Chapuis notes that the king's leg was better in January 1538. The phrasing implying this was notable improvement from a baseline of problems that had already been chronic for 2 years. He describes periods when the wound stopped, the fistula blocked, causing fever and acute incapacitation, followed by periods of drainage and relative relief. 1540. By this point, Chapuis is describing Henry's leg condition as a recurring crisis. In April 1540, he writes that the king's legs had closed up and that Henry had been immobile for 10 to 12 days. The blocking of the fistula, the wound closing at the surface while the infection continued underneath, was apparently the most acutely dangerous phase of the condition, producing systemic symptoms including fever that left Henry, in Chapuis's description, close to incapacitated. 1541. Chapuis notes Henry's increasing difficulty with physical mobility. There are references to the king's ability to process paperwork and conduct business from his chambers, rather than moving through the palace in the way that had characterized his earlier reign. The physical stage of kingship, the public performance of authority through movement and presence, was becoming increasingly difficult to sustain. 1543 to 1544. By this period, Henry's portraits are showing the full extent of the physical transformation that had occurred since 1536. The famous Holbein-derived portraits of the 1540s, the wide-legged stance, the immense physical presence, were being produced precisely as Henry's actual physical capacity was at its most compromised. This is visual propaganda in the literal sense. Images constructed to project an authority that the physical reality could no longer support. 1545. Ambassadorial dispatches from multiple courts note that Henry is rarely seen in public. His movement through Whitehall and Hampton Court requires physical assistance. The daily routine of court life is conducted without the king's regular participation. 1546. In the final year, the evidence converges. Chapuis has returned to his own country, but other ambassadors continue to report. Henry is described as rarely emerging from his chambers. The smell is noted. The physical scale is noted. The man who had been described by multiple observers in 1515 as the handsomest ruler in Christendom was, by 1546, described by the imperial ambassador as very obese, with an ulcerated leg that prevented him from walking. The specific medical diagnosis that best fits this constellation of symptoms, the chronic non-healing wound, the periods of acute blockage with systemic fever, the progressive immobility, the systemic effects including weight gain and possible neurological involvement, is chronic osteomyelitis. a bone infection that produces exactly this pattern. Without antibiotics, osteomyelitis is essentially untreatable. The infection persists within the bone tissue indefinitely, producing chronic wound discharge, periodic systemic crises, and progressive deterioration. The body cannot clear the infection. The immune system can contain it, but not eliminate it. Surgery in the Tudor era was far too crude and dangerous to address deep bone infection effectively. The weight gain that accompanied this is documentable through the armor at the Royal Armouries. Approximately 1,515, waist approximately 34 inches. Approximately 1,520, waist approximately 36 inches. Approximately 1,535, waist approximately 40 inches. Approximately 1,540, waist approximately 50 inches. Approximately 1,545, waist approximately 52 inches. This progression is consistent with the documented decline in physical activity. A man who had jousted, hunted, danced, and engaged in strenuous physical exercise throughout his 20s and 30s was, by his late 40s, unable to walk unaided. The caloric expenditure that had previously been enormous was essentially gone. The eating habits of a man who had maintained athletic conditioning did not adjust proportionally to the radical reduction in physical activity. The weight accumulated. The weight then created its own vicious cycle. Greater weight meant greater pressure on the leg, greater pressure on the wound, greater difficulty moving, further reduction in activity, further weight gain. It also meant, and this is documented in the contemporary accounts through the increasing number of people required to move the king, that the simple logistical problem of managing his body through the physical spaces of his palaces became progressively more complex. Henry's palaces, Whitehall, Hampton Court, Greenwich, were not designed for a man of his eventual dimensions. The corridors, doorways, and staircases of 16th century royal palaces were built for people of normal size, moving under their own power. The specific accommodations required, wider passages, mechanical assistance for lifting, wheeled conveyances, are alluded to in various contemporary accounts, though the specific details have sometimes been embellished in popular retellings beyond what the primary sources actually say. What is documented is the requirement for multiple servants simply to manage the king's physical needs at any given moment. Henry VIII, who had defined his kingship partly through the performance of physical excellence, the joust, the hunt, the tennis court, the dance floor, spent his final years unable to perform any of these things and required substantial assistance for tasks that most adults perform without thought. Part 6. The TBI question, what we can and cannot know. The question of whether Henry VIII suffered a traumatic brain injury in the 1536 jousting accident that contributed to or caused the dramatic behavioral changes of his final decade is one of the genuinely interesting questions in the intersection of history and medicine. It deserves more careful treatment than it usually receives in popular history, which tends to either dismiss it entirely or present it as established fact. The hypothesis was advanced in its most developed scholarly form by Susanna Lipscomb, a historian specializing in Henry VIII's court, and independently examined by Arash Salardini and colleagues in a 2016 paper in the Journal of Clinical Neuroscience. Both argued that the chronology of Henry's behavioral changes specifically the timing of the shift toward the pattern of extreme behavior that characterizes the final decade, was consistent with frontal lobe damage from the 1536 accident. The frontal lobe governs several cognitive and behavioral functions that are relevant here: impulse control, emotional regulation, the ability to modify behavior in response to social feedback, the capacity for empathy, and certain aspects of executive decision-making. Damage to the frontal lobe, which can result from traumatic brain injury even without obvious skull fracture, through the movement of the brain within the skull during impact, produces a recognizable pattern of behavioral change. Impaired impulse control, emotional volatility, reduced empathy, difficulty modifying behavior in response to consequences, and in some cases, paranoid ideation. The case for the hypothesis rests primarily on 1. The chronological evidence. The behavioral changes that Henry VIII's final decade is famous for the pattern of executing close associates. The escalating paranoia, the extreme volatility, are documented as concentrated in the period after January 1536 rather than before it. Before 1536, Henry executed people, but at a rate and with a degree of personal engagement that is qualitatively different from the post-1536 pattern. The execution of Anne Boleyn in May 1536, 4 months after the accident, is often cited as the beginning of the most extreme phase. 2. The nature of the accident. 2 hours of unconsciousness following head trauma is, in modern neurological assessment, significant. Unconsciousness lasting more than 30 minutes following a head injury is associated with moderate to severe traumatic brain injury. 2 hours of unconsciousness is consistent with substantial neurological impact. The specific mechanism, a fall from a horse with the horse falling on top of the rider, would have involved multiple impacts and the kind of rotational forces that are particularly associated with diffuse axonal injury. 3. The behavioral pattern. Contemporary descriptions of Henry's behavior after 1536 include elements that are specifically consistent with frontal lobe dysfunction. The sudden rages followed by apparent normalcy, the inability to maintain consistent emotional states, the escalating difficulty with social judgment, the increasing paranoia. These are not simply descriptions of a cruel man. They are descriptions of specific behavioral patterns that have neurological correlates. The case against the hypothesis rests on 1. The pre-existing pattern. Henry's behavior before 1536 was not without its troubling elements. The execution of the Duke of Buckingham in 1521, the treatment of Catherine of Aragon over years of attempted annulment proceedings, the execution of Thomas More and John Fisher in 1535. All of these suggest a man with some pre-existing tendency toward using lethal power when politically inconvenient. The behavioral change after 1536 may be one of degree rather than kind. 2. The absence of direct evidence. We have no brain imaging of Henry VIII. We cannot retrospectively assess neurological function. What we have are behavioral descriptions by observers who were not trained neurologists, filtered through their own political and personal motivations, and recorded in a form that necessarily omits much of what a clinical neurologist would want to know. 3. The confounding medical variables. Henry's chronic pain, his probable chronic infection and systemic inflammation, his increasingly restricted physical activity, his political position, and his aging were all producing real effects on his cognitive and emotional state that are independent of any TBI. Separating the specific contribution of a hypothetical frontal lobe injury from the aggregate effects of these other factors is essentially impossible with the evidence available. The honest conclusion is that the TBI hypothesis is plausible, has legitimate scholarly support, and provides a useful framework for thinking about the behavioral changes of the final decade, but cannot be established as fact, and should be presented as one potential explanation among several rather than as a confirmed diagnosis. This is the position that Lipscomb herself takes. She describes it as a hypothesis worthy of serious consideration, not as a certainty. What is certain, and what requires no hypothesis at all, is that Henry VIII's final decade was shaped by forces: physical pain, chronic infection, systemic inflammation, profound political isolation, the accumulation of personal losses that would have produced significant psychological effects in any human being, regardless of whether he also suffered neurological damage. Part 7. Power without a pilot, the Privy Council in Henry's final years. One of the less examined aspects of Henry's physical and mental decline is what it meant for the governance of England. A political system organized entirely around the will and capacity of a single monarch who was increasingly unable to exercise that will or maintain that capacity is a system with a structural problem, and understanding how that problem was managed reveals a great deal about both Tudor statecraft and the specific political legacy Henry left. The Privy Council had existed in various forms throughout Henry's reign. Under Thomas Cromwell in the 1530s, it had been reorganized into a more formally constituted body with defined membership and regular meetings. After Cromwell's execution in 1540, it became, by necessity, as Henry's health declined, an increasingly powerful decision-making body that operated formally as the King's Advisory Council, but practically as the mechanism through which England was actually governed. The key figures in the Privy Council of Henry's final years included Edward Seymour, the Earl of Hertford, Henry's brother-in-law as the brother of Jane Seymour, and therefore the uncle of the 9-year-old Prince Edward. Seymour was a competent military commander with strong Protestant sympathies and clear ambitions regarding the upcoming succession. He was positioning himself to control the regency that would govern during Edward VI's minority. John Dudley, Viscount Lisle, another military commander with Protestant sympathies who would become the dominant political figure of Edward VI's reign as Duke of Northumberland. Stephen Gardiner, Bishop of Winchester, the leading conservative Catholic voice on the council who opposed Seymour and Dudley and sought to maintain a more traditional theological position. Thomas Cranmer, Archbishop of Canterbury, who had been Henry's key ecclesiastical instrument since 1533, and who held theological views that had moved significantly toward Protestantism in the years since. The dynamic between these men, and particularly between the Protestant-leaning Seymour/Dudley faction and the conservative Gardiner, shaped the final years of Henry's reign in ways that Henry was often too incapacitated to effectively manage. The exclusion of Gardiner from Henry's last will and testament, which named the 16 executors who would govern during Edward VI's minority, has been a matter of historical debate. Was this Henry's genuine decision, Or was it the work of Seymour and his allies, managing a dying king who could no longer fully control what was done in his name? This question matters because it speaks to the specific nature of Henry's decline. The historiographical argument is sometimes framed as whether Henry remained in control until the end, or whether power had effectively passed to the council before his death. The most accurate answer appears to be neither cleanly. Henry retained the capacity for occasional decisive intervention, the near arrest of Catherine Parr in 1546 and its reversal, for instance, but was increasingly unable to manage the day-to-day governance of the kingdom or to maintain consistent oversight of his council's operations. The practical consequence was that the men who would control the succession had approximately 4 years, from roughly 1543 onward, in which they were operating in the space created by Henry's incapacity, managing information flow to the king, managing access to the king, and positioning themselves for the moment when the succession actually occurred. This was not a coup. It was a more subtle process of institutional adjustment to the reality that the monarch could no longer fully perform the functions his position required. The political stakes of this adjustment were enormous. Henry's will, as finalized in December 1546, established a council of 16 executors, not a single regent, to govern during Edward VI's minority. This council-based regency was a deliberate attempt to prevent any single person from achieving the kind of dominant power that might make Edward VI's position insecure. Within days of Henry's death, Edward Seymour had himself declared Lord Protector and concentrated power in a way that Henry's will had explicitly tried to prevent. Whether Henry would have sanctioned this had he lived is one of the interesting counterfactual questions in Tudor history. What is not counterfactual is that the system Henry had built, absolute monarchy organized entirely around his own will, could not survive the absence of that will, and that the process of transition from one reign to the next exposed every structural weakness in that organization. Part 8. The death of Henry VIII. What actually happened? The final days of Henry VIII's life are documented primarily through 3 sources: the state papers and Privy Council records, which tell us what the government was doing around the dying king, the account of Archbishop Thomas Cranmer, whose letters describe his presence at the deathbed, and various diplomatic reports from foreign ambassadors, which provide external perspectives on events that the English government was trying to manage. By Christmas 1546, Henry was confined to his chambers at Whitehall. The business of government was being conducted by the Privy Council, with decreasing personal involvement from the king. State documents were still being formally authorized by Henry. The stamp of his signature, rather than his actual signature, was in use by this point, a device that allowed official authorization without requiring the king's physical capacity to write clearly, but the decision-making process was increasingly council-driven. In January 1547, Henry's condition deteriorated rapidly. The leg infection that had been chronic for 11 years appears to have entered a more acute phase. The systemic effects, fever, toxicity, organ stress, that had been periodic through the previous decade became persistent. Contemporary accounts suggest that by mid-January, those closest to Henry understood that the king was dying, though publicly this was not acknowledged. The political management of Henry's dying was a delicate operation. Telling the king he was dying was technically treasonous under legislation Henry himself had passed. Predicting the king's death was classed as a form of treason, which meant that his physicians were legally unable to tell him what his condition was progressing toward. This extraordinary legal constraint meant that the king, who was dying, was surrounded by people who were legally barred from telling him what they all knew. Archbishop Cranmer was summoned to Whitehall near midnight on the night of January 27 to 28, 1547. This specific timing, past midnight, the summons urgent, suggests that Henry had moved into the final phase, and that those around him understood that death was imminent. Cranmer wrote afterward that he found Henry barely able to speak. The swollen tongue that appears in multiple contemporary accounts of Henry's final weeks, consistent with generalized edema from organ failure, would have made speech physically difficult. Cranmer asked Henry to give some sign that he died in faith, to squeeze his hand if he trusted in the mercy of Christ. Henry squeezed his hand. Cranmer described the grip as weak, but it was there. Henry VIII died in the early hours of January 28, 1547. He was 55 years old. He had reigned for 37 years, 9 months, and 4 days. The death was kept secret by the Privy Council for approximately 3 days. This was standard political practice during succession transitions. The announcement of the king's death triggered a series of legal and political events that needed to be managed in a specific sequence, and announcing it prematurely or without the proper arrangements in place could create dangerous instability. The Regency Council needed to be formally constituted, the 9-year-old Edward VI needed to be secured, and the various political actors who would have competing agendas needed to be managed before the public announcement created space for any of them to act. The practical problem of Henry's corpse, which was large, diseased, and decomposing with the speed that a body in his condition would decompose, compounded the political management challenge. The Elias Griffith Chronicles account of the Sion Abbey incident, whatever its precise details, reflects a genuine logistical reality. Henry's body was difficult to manage. The embalming available was inadequate, and the process of transporting it from Whitehall to Windsor took longer and was more complicated than a normal royal burial would have been. Henry VIII was buried at Windsor Castle on February 16, 1547, in St. George's Chapel, alongside Jane Seymour, his own expressed wish, honored even in circumstances where other logistical priorities might have taken precedence. The elaborate funeral ceremonies originally planned were considerably simplified, partly because of the practical difficulties, and partly because the new government's attention had already shifted to the living king rather than the dead one. The Duke of Norfolk, Thomas Howard, the most powerful nobleman of the old Catholic-leaning faction, who had served Henry faithfully for decades but had fallen from favor in the political maneuvering of the final year, had been condemned to death in January 1547 and was awaiting execution when Henry died. The king's death on the morning of January 28 occurred, apparently, before the death warrant had been signed and executed. Norfolk spent 6 years in the Tower of London, surviving to be released when Mary I took the throne in 1553. The timing of Henry's death, which was almost certainly coincidental, saved Norfolk's life. Part 9. What Henry built and what survived. Henry VIII has been assessed by historians across a very wide range of interpretations, from near-absolute condemnation to qualified rehabilitation, and the range of these assessments is itself historically interesting. The condemnation case is straightforward. Henry executed approximately 70 people for reasons that ranged from the legally questionable to the outright manufactured. He dissolved the monasteries in a process that transferred enormous wealth to the crown and the aristocracy, while destroying institutions that had provided social services, education, medical care, care for the poor, that the Reformation's settlement did not adequately replace. He used his position as supreme head of the Church to impose his own theological preferences, executing both Catholics who refused his supremacy and Protestants who went further in reform than he approved. And his personal behavior toward his wives, particularly Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard, represents the use of judicial murder for personal convenience at a scale that even his own era found disturbing. The rehabilitation case is more complex and requires more historical context. The administrative restructuring of the English state that occurred under Henry, much of it through Cromwell's design, produced institutions of genuinely durable significance. The strengthened Privy Council, the reformed system of royal finances, the parliamentary legislation that established English royal supremacy over the Church. These institutional developments outlasted Henry by centuries. The Church of England, which traces its formal establishment to the legislative programme of 1532 to 1534, remains one of the world's major Christian denominations. The cultural patronage of Henry's court is often overlooked in the medical and psychological narrative that dominates popular accounts of his reign. Hans Holbein produced some of the defining portraits of the Northern Renaissance under Henry's patronage. Thomas Tallis, whose choral music is still performed today, served in Henry's Chapel Royal. The humanist scholarship that Henry had encouraged in his education continued to flourish at his court even as the political and religious climate became more dangerous. Nicholas Kratzer, the royal astronomer John Leland, the royal antiquary who documented English history and geography, William Tyndale's English translation of the Bible, which drew on the intellectual environment created partly by the Reformation context. These are not minor contributions. What Henry left to England was, in the most accurate summary, a genuinely transformed institutional landscape at the cost of enormous personal and social suffering, administered by a man whose exceptional gifts and severe limitations were both, in different ways, essential to the transformation. The exceptional gifts, the intelligence, the learning, the political instincts, the capacity to attract and deploy talented men, the ability to project authority so effectively that his physical deterioration could be concealed for years, the genuine theological sophistication that made the English Reformation something more than a personal divorce. The severe limitations, the inability to acknowledge constraint, the treatment of human beings as instruments of his will, the judicial murder of people who had served him loyally, the psychological framework that made opposition to him feel like cosmic disorder rather than reasonable political disagreement. These things are not separable in Henry VIII's legacy. The same psychological formation that made him able to break with Rome, the absolute certainty that his will was aligned with God's will, was what made him capable of executing Thomas More, a man he had genuinely respected and admired for refusing to affirm that certainty publicly. The same intellectual gifts that made him a genuine theologian made him a dangerous opponent for anyone who disagreed with his theological conclusions. Henry VIII's England is one of the clearest historical examples of a system that produces extraordinary outcomes that genuinely shaped the modern world, at the cost of the specific human beings who encountered the system's center. Part 10. Edward VI and the collapse of what Henry built. Henry VIII died, convinced that what he had built would endure. The 6-year-old Edward VI, who had been baptized with enormous ceremony in 1537, was, in Henry's framework, the validation of everything, the male heir that God had finally provided, the proof that the Reformation settlement had been correct, the continuation of the Tudor dynasty on the terms Henry had negotiated at such enormous cost. Edward VI reigned for 6 years, 2 months, and 13 days. He died on July 6, 1553, at the age of 15, probably of tuberculosis. He never ruled independently. The entire span of his reign was governed first by Edward Seymour as Lord Protector, and then by John Dudley as Lord President of the Council. The Protestant Reformation that Henry had begun, but carefully constrained within his own conservative theological limits, moved decisively further under Edward VI. The Mass was abolished. The churches were stripped of images and decorations. The Book of Common Prayer, authored by Thomas Cranmer, was introduced in 1549 and established English as the language of church services. The doctrinal changes that Henry had explicitly resisted, the move away from transubstantiation, the reduction of the sacraments from 7 to 2, the dismantling of clerical celibacy requirements, all occurred in the 6 years after his death. Henry would almost certainly not have approved of where the Reformation went under Edward VI. The Protestant settlement of Edward's reign was not what Henry had built, it was what his successors built using the institutional framework he had created, pushed much further in a direction Henry had explicitly opposed. The specific tragedy of Edward VI's short reign is beyond the scope of this script, but its relevance to Henry's story is this. The thing Henry most wanted, the male heir who would perpetuate the Tudor dynasty on Henry's terms, died at 15, having pushed England in a theological direction Henry had executed men for advocating. After Edward came Mary I, Henry's daughter by Catherine of Aragon, who restored England to papal obedience, executed nearly 300 Protestant dissenters in a reign that earned her the historical name Bloody Mary, and died in 1558 without the heir who might have consolidated the Catholic Restoration. After Mary came Elizabeth I, Henry's daughter by Anne Boleyn, who established the religious settlement that became the Church of England, as it has existed in its essential form ever since, a compromise settlement explicitly designed to contain both Catholic and Protestant elements. Neither the Catholicism without the Pope that Henry had practiced, nor the thoroughgoing Protestantism that Edward's reign had produced. Elizabeth I reigned for 45 years. She died without heirs, ending the Tudor dynasty. Henry's project, as he had conceived it, the male heir, the perpetuation of the Tudor line, the English Church precisely as he had defined it, did not survive him by a generation. What survived him was something different, the institutional consequences of the break with Rome. The parliamentary legislation of the Reformation, the administrative reforms of the Cromwellian period, and the transformed distribution of property produced by the dissolution of the monasteries. These things outlasted the Tudors. They outlasted the Stuarts. They outlasted the Civil War and the Restoration and the Glorious Revolution. The Church of England, the role of Parliament in English governance, the distribution of landed property that shapes English society to the present day. All of these were shaped in fundamental ways by decisions made during Henry VIII's reign. Henry himself did not foresee most of this. He was not, in the end, building a modern state. He was trying to secure his dynasty, validate his marriage decisions, and maintain the theological position he had concluded was correct. That his specific goals largely failed, while the institutional consequences of pursuing them transformed his country for centuries, is one of the more profound ironies of his historical legacy. In 1515, Pasqualigo wrote that Henry's leg below the knee was of a roundness and beauty such as could not be improved upon. He was describing the physical embodiment of a Renaissance ideal, a king who seemed to have been designed to rule. 31 years later, that leg contained open wounds that had not healed in a decade, drained daily by physicians who could do nothing more than manage the fluid, mask the smell, and watch a king in chronic, unrelenting pain try to maintain the performance of royal authority while his body dismantled itself from the inside out. Between those two images lies one of the most extensively documented personal deteriorations in the historical record. We can trace it in Chappice's dispatches, in the measurements of surviving armor, in the evolution of Henry's portraits. From the athletic young man of the early reign to the massive, carefully staged presence of the Holbein-derived images of the 1540s. We can hear it in Cranmer's account of a hand that squeezed weakly in the dark early hours of January 28, 1547. We can see its final grotesque coda in Elias Griffith's account of a coffin that leaked in a monastery Henry had dissolved. Henry VIII was one of the most gifted men ever to hold the English throne. He was also one of the most destructive. These two things were, in his specific case, inseparable. The same psychological formation that produced the gifts produced the destruction, and the historical legacy of his reign cannot be accurately described by either category alone. What the medical story adds to the historical record is specificity. This was a man who spent 11 years in chronic, inadequately managed pain, watching his body fail him in ways that no physician of his era had the tools to address, while trying to maintain the public performance of an authority that his physical reality was progressively undermining. The political consequences of that pain, the volatility, the paranoia, the escalating judicial violence, were not separable from the medical reality that produced them. The distance between those two descriptions, the leg of a roundness and beauty such as could not be improved upon, and the weeping, unhealing fistulas documented in the dispatches of the 1540s, is the actual story of Henry VIII. Not the tabloid version, the documented version, which is, as it turns out, considerably more disturbing than anything that needs to be invented. I want to say something directly about why this script exists in the form it does. The source material I was working from when I first researched this topic was a video that told the story of Henry VIII's decline through a series of secret documents, hidden diaries, suppressed medical notes, 10th rays revealing concealed paintings. Every dramatic claim came packaged in the language of conspiracy and suppression. The truth historians don't want you to know, discovered, hidden, finally revealed. I've talked in other scripts about why this framing is specifically dangerous. It's not just that the individual claims are false, though many of them are. It's that the framing itself is a machine for producing epistemic confusion. When you tell people that the evidence for your claims is secret, you've made your claims essentially unfalsifiable. The absence of scholarly confirmation becomes evidence of suppression rather than evidence against the claim. What I want to say here, having spent a significant amount of time with the verified primary sources on Henry VIII's decline, is something slightly different. The real story doesn't need the secret documents. It doesn't need the hidden diary. The armor at the Royal Armories is a public object in a public museum that anyone can visit. Chapais's dispatches are in published scholarly editions. Cranmer's letters are accessible. The Eli's Griffith Chronicle is documented. The medical literature on osteomyelitis, on the neurological effects of chronic pain, on the specific medical hypotheses proposed by Lipscomb and Salardini, all of this is public, published, and available. The tragedy of the secret document framing is not just that it's dishonest. It's that it actively makes the real story harder to see. When you're telling people about a hidden diary discovered in 1983, you're not only inventing evidence, you're displacing attention from the actual evidence that exists, and that is, in every way that matters, more compelling. Henry VIII spent 11 years in pain that no physician of his era could adequately treat, managing a kingdom through political systems that depended on his personal authority at precisely the moment that his capacity to exercise that authority was being dismantled by his own body. He maintained the performance of royal power through extraordinary physical and psychological effort. Commissions of portraits that depicted the king he could no longer be, use of perfumes and aromatic preparations to manage a smell that contemporaries noted as overwhelming. Construction of a public image that was increasingly disconnected from the private reality. He died with Cranmer holding his hand, squeezing it weakly in the darkness. His coffin leaked in a monastery he had destroyed. His male heir died at 15. His dynasty ended without descendants within 2 generations. None of this requires a secret. All of it is in the record. That's what I find most worth noting about this particular case. The real story is not only more accurate than the embellished version. It is more interesting. It is more humanly complex. It is more historically significant. It does not require any enhancement, because what actually happened is already almost unbelievably dramatic. The truth about Henry VIII was available to anyone who looked for 475 years. The people who told you it was secret were not uncovering it. They were covering it. I'll see you in the dark.